At Christmas 1819, a month before his death, King George III did something that was both crazy and kind of impressive. He taught complete gibberish for 58 hours straight. George had been living under virtual house arrest for 8 years while his son ran the country. He had repeatedly struggled with mental health issues throughout his life, but in 1810 he became so ill that he could never be seen in public again. By the time he died in January 1820, he had totally lost touch with reality, unable to even understand that his beloved wife of 57 years had died. George III's mental decline is often played for laughs, but it has actually been one of the biggest historical mysteries. What was actually wrong with England's mad king? His doctors made notes of strange symptoms, like the fact that George's urine was often blue. Modern psychiatrists have attempted diagnoses, but the true cause of George's mental illness may be found in the shocking contents of his hair. George's troubles began when he took his first breath on June 4, 1738. He was born 2 months early, and doctors initially thought he wouldn't survive. George's father was Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his grandfather was King George II. He was second in line for the throne at his birth, but a shocking turn of events would bring him to power sooner than anyone imagined. George was actually quite smart. By 8 years old, he could speak, write, and read in both English and German. By the way, George's family was from Germany. His great-grandfather, George I, was the Elector of Hanover until he randomly became King of England at the age of 54. He never spoke English well and had to talk to his ministers in Latin. George III would be better prepared. As a young man, he read widely and even wrote a personal essay against slavery, which suggests George was surprisingly ahead of his time. Sadly, his family life was a tale as old as time. The thing about George's family was they all pretty much hated each other. George I and his son, George II, hated each other. George II and his son, Frederick, hated each other. And George III would wind up hating his son, George IV, too. Because Frederick disliked his father, he kept his son away. But things really got awkward when Frederick suddenly died in 1751. Young George III was now heir to the throne at the age of 13. This didn't bring him closer to his grandfather at all. Their relationship remained chilly and distant. Young George was brought up instead by his mother and his late father's friends. In the fall of October 25, 1760, George II died, making his grandson the new sovereign at just 22 years old. Now king, he decided to find a queen. George had fallen in love with Sarah Lennox, the bewitching daughter of a nobleman several years prior. George was shy and had largely lived a secluded life before meeting Sarah, and she lost no time wrapping him around her finger. It seems like George had his first experiences with her. Much to her shock, however, he was forbidden to marry her because she wasn't a royal. Instead, at his mother's suggestion, George chose the German Princess Charlotte. Sarah Lennox would actually, and somewhat bizarrely, serve as maid of honor at their wedding. Awkward. George and Charlotte's marriage proved to be highly unusual in other ways. Despite the sudden arrangement, the royal couple genuinely did love each other. The two wed shortly after her arrival in September 1761, and their coronation was held 2 weeks later. Throughout their life together, they had a total of 15 children. Pretty good proof that they enjoyed each other's company. The strangest part of all? George never took a mistress, ever. That's pretty weird behavior for a king. But of course, George's behavior would get far weirder, and not in a good way. King George III's first few years on the throne were precarious. He oversaw the 7 Years' War, in which Britain made huge gains in Canada, India, and the Caribbean. It cost a fortune, which forced Britain to raise new taxes. and that provoked the worst disaster of George's reign, the American Revolution. Other than his madness, which didn't come until later, this is the thing George is most remembered for. Many label him as a tyrant, while others say he was simply following initiatives set forward by his ministers. So how responsible was George for the loss of America? The American Revolution began on April 19, 1775, and led to several years of frustration and angst on the king's part. He was largely accused of keeping British troops at war, refusing to surrender and acknowledge the US's dependence, even going as far as hiring German mercenaries to fight alongside his army, which caused plenty of outrage. Following the loss in Yorktown in 1781, George found it exceptionally difficult to accept his loss against the American rebels, even considering abdicating the throne due to his failure. Following the outcome of the war, the unpopular Lord North was replaced as Prime Minister by William Pitt the Younger, who would remain in the job for 18 years. It's important to point out that George wasn't a dictator. He couldn't do just anything he wanted. He had a lot of influence, sure, but Parliament could, and sometimes did, defy him. He would always give ministers and prime ministers his opinion, but if they disagreed, he'd tell them to do what they thought best, but not to come crying to him if they were proved wrong. George must have been baffled by the Americans' insistence that he was a tyrant. He firmly believed that his job as king was to defend the rights and freedoms of common people against aristocrats, who wanted all the power and money for themselves. Surprisingly, George remained popular with the British people, despite the loss of America. His subjects appreciated that he wasn't lavish and didn't cheat on his wife. He was also famous for taking an interest in science and agriculture. Nobles considered these inappropriate interests for a ruler, but ordinary people liked that their king had a common touch. His nickname, Farmer George, may have started as an insult, but it became a term of endearment. Unfortunately, this did not last. By the 1780s, George started to experience terrible mental and physical symptoms from an unknown disease that scientists have only recently begun to understand. George began suffering from bloated limbs, joint pain, vomiting, and spasms. Most disturbingly, his behavior radically changed. He started speaking endlessly and nonsensely until he was foaming at the mouth. Doctors of that time didn't have the ability to diagnose and treat George properly, but having a king who was incapacitated was a national emergency, so desperate measures were taken. Enter Dr. Francis Willis, a doctor who ran an asylum with an unusual take on mental health treatment. Because these issues weren't understood well at the time, Dr. Willis's practice were considered reasonable, no matter how terrifying. Whenever King George started presenting symptoms, Dr. Willis applied treatments that we would consider barbaric today. The king was forcibly restrained in a straitjacket or fed dangerous medicines that caused him to vomit and make his skin blister. Unsurprisingly, none of this helped George get better. In fact, the medicines themselves may provide a tantalizing clue as to what was really going on, as we'll later see. While the king was becoming more unstable, Prime Minister Pitt and other members of Parliament became more and more worried that he would have to be replaced. In 1789, they almost passed a regency bill to replace the king with his son, the Prince of Wales, at least temporarily. But the prince, the future George IV, was a political troublemaker, and Pitt was desperate to keep him out of power. Miraculously, George recovered from his bout of madness. Despite his illness, King George was a devoted and attentive king, which earned him the respect of his politicians. So much so that in his absence they realized how much they needed his calmness. Not long after George recovered, another war broke out. The French Revolution began in 1789, and by 1793, France had officially declared war on Great Britain. Pitt and the king worked side by side to deal with the crisis, which in turn made the king even more popular. But George's recovery was only temporary. Soon he would be forced to give up his power for good. By 1810, the king had suffered several relapses and by then was almost blind from his cataracts. George's mental health was finally destroyed for good the following year by a personal tragedy. In 1811, his favorite and youngest daughter, Princess Amelia, died of measles at the age of 27. He was completely distraught, and by the end of the year, he was declared permanently insane. He authorized the Regency Act of 1811, and his son took his place as monarch as he was no longer fit to rule. He lived for 9 more torturous years at Windsor Castle, developed dementia and became completely deaf and blind before eventually dying of pneumonia on January 29, 1820. But now we come to the biggest question. What actually happened to George III? Was his illness mental, physical, or some combination? One of the stranger symptoms we mentioned at the beginning was that George's doctors noted that he had blue urine. This led to the most controversial theory about the king's illness, that he had porphyria. Porphyria is a genetic disease that affects the nervous system and prevents the body from producing hemoglobin. One of the symptoms is blue or purple urine. This theory was first proposed by a pair of doctors in the 1960s, but it has been roundly rejected by other experts. One of the reasons the porphyria theory was suggested was because it seemed to eliminate the stigma of mental health problems associated with the royal family. But this presented a whole new set of problems if this was true. Because porphyria was a genetic disease, this would mean that it would be passed down to future generations of monarchs. 2 other doctors had offered a more plausible theory about the king's supposed madness. George wrote prolifically, so they were able to analyze thousands of his handwritten letters to study his use of language. They determined that during the periods where George was most unwell, his sentences were longer than when he was healthy. But these weren't just unusually long sentences. These were 400-word sentences. When he was sick, he had the habit of repeating himself, with his vocabulary becoming more intricate and creative. Psychiatrists see similar symptoms of non-stop speech and writing during a manic episode in those suffering from bipolar disorder. Once the euphoria and hyperactivity fades, the person will usually experience bouts of depression. The theory that George experienced manic episodes also coincides with the testimony of eyewitnesses. George's medical records show that he was being prescribed medicine based on gentian. This plant, characterized by its deep blue flowers, is still commonly used and can cause urine to turn blue. This means that the king's blue urine might actually have been caused by his doctors. But there's one more twist. In 2005, scientists studied George's hair and found that it contained arsenic, a lot of it, 17 times the amount that would qualify as arsenic poisoning. It turns out George was taking medicine containing antimony, an element that's often found alongside arsenic in nature. Over time, his body was filled with the stuff, causing all kinds of side effects. In the end, the cure may well have worsened his disease. That's all for this video. What do you think about George III's legacy? What do you think caused his illness? Was he the best character in Hamilton? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more cool historical content. Thanks for watching.